Greetings. My name is Brother Dr. Guy L. Beck, 32nd degree Northern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. I'm also a lecturer in Asian religions at Tulane University. This session will be about Freemasonry in India. It will begin with looking at Freemasonry in the British Empire, followed by the colonial expansion into India, followed by a discussion of how Hindus became Freemasons, and then a focus on particular names like Brother P.C. Dutt and Narendranath Dutt, who also is famous as Swami Vivekananda. And these two men were Masons and became very famous as well within India. Let me begin by talking about Freemasonry in the British Empire. While there is a considerable wealth of historical material on European and American Freemasonry, until recently there was a lack of material on the effects of Freemasonry on various parts of the world during British colonialism. This perpetuated the misleading assumption that imperialism was defined primarily by notions of the superiority of, quote, Christian civilization, unquote. Professor Jessica L. Harlan Jacobs, in her book Builders of Empire, Freemasons and British Imperialism, 1717 to 1927, compels us to rethink the entire empire scenario in terms of a universalistic fraternalism, arguing that the British Empire was essentially a worldwide fraternal enterprise. Quote, she says that my argument that the modern world's first and most successful fraternal organization was, from its very beginnings, intimately bound up with imperialism, suggests that to a very great extent the British Empire was a fraternal enterprise. She has duly noted the lack of scholarship on colonial Freemasonry. The further implications of her work have underscored the need to view Freemasonry not as an obscure men's club, esoteric religion, or secret society, but as a fundamentally powerful dynamic behind the emergence and spread of modern civilization. Professor Harlan Jacobs described the dissemination process as the establishment of a vast world masonic network that was linked together on all levels. The Grand Lodge of England, as the Mother Lodge, retained control over this vast network and its rapid expansion. Yet the bond between the empire and the colonies was only as strong as the Masonic associations of its participants. The presence of Freemasonry outside of Europe brought it into direct confrontation with non-Europeans, who, while trained to assist in the affairs of empire, gradually sought a more secure place within it. The Masonic universal principles were now to be seriously tested. Quote, meanwhile, outside the settlement colonies, indigenous men of various religious and racial backgrounds had begun seeking admission into Masonry. The empire became a practical testing ground for Freemasons and their commitment to the ideology of cosmopolitan brotherhood in an age of increasingly racialized attitudes, unquote. Yet the developing situation became more complex as indigenous members may have had ulterior motives for membership. As she explained, as it turns out, many indigenous elites were attracted to Masonry because of its ideology of cosmopolitan brotherhood, an ideology that could be used as much to undermine as to uphold British imperialism, unquote. Among all of the various points of contact between Freemasonry and indigenous natives in the colonies, it was actually in India that the principles of universal fraternalism would not only be tested, but become the basis for new forms of creative syncretism, which is described in this work also as Masonic Vedanta. Freemasonry in India. Always a fertile ground for the formation of diverse religions, India was the birthplace of Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. India has also sheltered many many religious refugees from other parts of the world. For example, Many Jews found refuge in southern India after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. When St. Thomas the Apostle allegedly arrived in India with a small following about 52 CE, he is believed to have planted the seeds for a permanent Indian Christian community. The Zoroastrians, or Parsis as they are called, found asylum when they were driven out of Iran by the 10th century. India is also home to the second largest Muslim population in the world. When the Tibetan Buddhists were persecuted in their own land by the Chinese communists, hundreds of refugees found safety in India after 1959. All of these occurrences exemplify the tolerance, diversity, and understanding in a South Asia permeated with Hindu values and ideals. When Freemasonry first arrived in India, the Fraternity of Universal Brotherhood found a ready environment, seasoned by centuries of religious toleration, for the practical application of its own principles of tolerance. On December 28, 1728, a small group of English Masons residing in Calcutta petitioned the Grand Lodge of England to form a provincial Grand Lodge in India. Quote, "A petition was presented to the chair signed by several persons being Masons, now living at Fort William in Bengal in the East Indies, wherein they acknowledged the authority of the Grand Master of England and humbly prayed to be constituted a regular lodge." Unquote. These quotes are from lodge records of the time. The Grand Master approved the petition on February 6, 1729, and authorized Brother George Pomfret to form a regular lodge at Fort William. Captain Brother Ralph Fairwinter was appointed Provincial Grand Master for East India and Bengal, and Brother James Dawson was appointed Provincial Grand Master for East Indies. According to the record, there is mention of Captain Fairwinter establishing Lodge number 72 at Fort William, Calcutta, in 1730. Fort William Lodge was a military lodge composed of soldiers and members of the British East India Company. Military lodges were instrumental in spreading the craft throughout the British Empire. The oldest continuing Masonic lodge in India is the lodge called Star in the East, number 67, established in Calcutta in 1740. The Provincial Grand Lodge of Madras was established in 1752, and the Provincial Grand Lodge of Bombay, today known as Mumbai, was established in 1758. A Masonic lodge was established in Surat in 1798, while Pune, now Pune, had a Masonic lodge in 1818. Several lodges were established in Pondicherry under the jurisdiction of the Grand Orient of France in the 1780s. Most major civic events were attended with Masonic ceremony, especially the laying of the cornerstone for many new government buildings, like the new Customs House, Parliament, Writers' Building, and the High Court in Calcutta and Mumbai. Early patrons of the craft in colonial India included the first Governor-General Lord Hastings, Lord Dalhousie, Lord Mayo, the Earl of Myra, Lord Bentinck, and Lord Prinsep. In early colonial times, the British neither encouraged nor informed the Indian subjects about Freemasonry. Masonry had occupied a prominent place within the British Empire and was not something actually to be handed over quickly to the native Indians. The Masonic lodges were closed venues where the Europeans could mingle socially and not have to mix with their Indian subjects. But by the end of the 19th century, members of the Indian elite, Muslim Nawabs, Hindu Maharajas, and philosophers, professionals and administrators were joining Freemasonry in droves. The British colonial culture gradually interacted on many levels with the growing Bengali elite, from which the earliest Indian members of Freemasonry were drawn. The arena for this interaction was the city of Calcutta, where the participants in the interaction were the colonial officers, professionals, that is, educators, scholars, doctors, and lawyers, businessmen, missionaries from England, and urban, Western-educated, upper-caste Bengali elite. Bengal was the place where the language of Bengali was spoken at the time in Calcutta. After the British established control over Bengal in 1757, many upper caste Bengalis, they were of various castes, like Brahmins, Kayasthas, and Vaidhas, entered into relations with British commercial, financial, and administrative organizations in Calcutta, from which they realized great economic benefit. At the time of the establishment of British authority, there existed an elite society in Bengal whose tastes and manners were cosmopolitan, who was often more learned in Persian than in Sanskrit, and who was caught up in administrative and commercial affairs. Members of this group were quick to reach out for a place in the new system, not only in the areas of administration and commerce, but in the spheres of culture and social exchange as well. One of the ways in which the rising class of Hindu elites sought inclusion in the fruits of empire was in their being accepted into the fraternal association of Masons. Next, Hindus become Masons. By the 1870s, British Freemasons began freely admitting Hindus, provided that they recognized a unified supreme deity over and above the various Hindu gods and goddesses. Normally, Hinduism appears to be polytheistic, with many, many different gods, many goddesses, many forms of divinity that are worshipped. And so it posed a number of challenges for the Hindus if they sought admission into a lodge. They had to argue that, well, all these gods are in fact part of one supreme god, or else aspects of one god. Through careful manipulation of the concepts of unity that are described in the philosophy of India called Vedanta, which is more of a unified philosophical system that seeks to blend all the notions of Godhead into one, or divinity into one Godhead. Through careful manipulation of these concepts into a single absolute, otherwise known as Brahman, that was also understood as personal, Hindus could be viewed as monotheistic by Masonic standards. As we know, Freemasonry is a monotheistic kind of approach to spiritual life. And so in order for a member to be accepted into a Masonic lodge, he must conform to kind of a monotheistic conception of God, although it doesn't describe or define that beyond that very much. So the understanding and articulation of the feature, that is, of sort of regrouping the Hindu gods and goddesses into one absolute monotheistic deity, was the single most important step in preparing Hindus for the successful journey into Freemasonry. In short, a growing emphasis on monotheism, especially among upper-class and English-educated Hindus, was able to, in fact, downplay the perceived polytheistic background of many Hindus. However, the process was not necessarily smooth or easy, but involved a number of twists and turns through various challenges on both sides. First of all, we talk about challenges to Hindu Masonry. While in theory the doors of Freemasonry are open to men of all creeds and races, the strict application of the Masonic principles of tolerance and equality by the English colonists proved to be a considerable challenge. Since Masonic lodges in Europe were almost exclusively staffed and governed by Europeans in the early years, the tenet of universal brotherhood vowed by them had not been actually seriously tested until now. The Duke of Sussex, as a Grand Master in London, was determined to make Masonry a genuinely universal brotherhood, having stated in the 1840s that, quote, "let a man's religion or mode of worship be what it may," unquote. This principle had in fact been in the minds of Masons both in England and in the colonies, but it still remained something that needed to be applied or tested. The first practical test of this tenet was placed before the lodges in India. It was in India that the truly universal nature of the craft was to be shown. In the early 1800s, European Masons in India extended membership to acknowledged monotheists, such as Muslims and Parsis, but were in fact at first reluctant to admit Hindus. Hindus appeared not as monotheists but as polytheists, venerating in fact a variety of anthropomorphic or human-like and theriomorphic or animal-like statues, sometimes derogatorily described as idols. through a bewildering array of ritualistic practices and gestures. As mentioned by Masonic author John Hamill, it appeared to the 19th century English Masons that Hindus believed in a multiplicity of gods and therefore could not satisfy the basic qualification for initiation, that is, belief in a one supreme being. Unquote. As such, most of the colonial Masons were devout Christians, in fact, Protestants. In reference to this fact, Professor Harlan Jacobs has explained that, quote, as the Catholic Church waged a sustained campaign against worldwide Freemasonry, the Brotherhood became a primarily Protestant institution, unquote. From the perspective of Christianity, whether Catholic or Protestant, the Hindus were idolaters, as seen, of false gods and goddesses who believed in a variety of superstitions, thus declassifying them as candidates for membership in lodges that recognized one great architect of the universe. The liberal acceptance of non-Europeans in Masonry was further complicated by, in fact, two historical events that occurred in the mid-century. One, the Mutiny of 1857, causing Freemasonry's leaders to stop admission of all native-born candidates, and number two, the reinforcement of certain bylaws in the early 1860s by the Provincial Grand Master of Bengal. The first Indian native to be actually initiated into Freemasonry was a Muslim, Omdat-ul-Omra, eldest son of the Nawab of Karnataka, in 1776. Next, some Parsis, that is, Zoroastrian faith people, were admitted to colonial lodges in Bombay in the early 1800s. It is less surprising that Muslims and Parsis were admitted much earlier than their Hindu brethren, for reasons being their visible submission to one supreme being, and the fact that they were more readily absorbed into the economic and political world of the English-speaking empire. Yet by the 1840s, only a small group of Indian Muslims and Parsis were members of the craft. According to Professor Harlan Jacobs, the admission of Indians at this juncture depended on several factors. Quote, the candidate's religion and social status, the jurisdiction into which he sought inclusion, sibling rivalry between English and Scottish lodges, and the attitudes of provincial Masonic leaders. During the 1840s, admission was unlikely, but not, in fact, impossible. The unrest of the subsequent decade brought the limited trend toward inclusiveness to a standstill. Despite the situation, however, records have revealed a few exceptions to the exclusionary trend. As such, at least two South Indian Hindus were admitted in 1857. Brother Ranganath Shastri, of a Brahmin origin, of Lodge Perfect Unanimity, number 233, according to G.S. Gupta. So this gentleman, Brother Ranganath Shastri, is actually regarded as the first Hindu Mason, followed by Murugesa Mudaliar in Lodge Universal Charity, both in Madras. In fact, in Madras between 1855 and 1869, Lodge Rock number 260 initiated, beside a Muslim and a Parsi, a Mudaliar, that is an agricultural laborer caste member, a Chetty, a merchant caste, a Pillai, that is an agricultural caste, and a Naidu, a warrior caste, an Iyengar, a Brahmin caste, and an Iyer, a Shaivite Brahmin, a priestly, separate priestly caste. 6 relatively different Hindu caste names. Lodge Rock between 1863 and 1877 initiated 17 Hindus of 7 different caste names. This unprecedented occurrence of different castes being willing to sit together and socialize on the level, as it were, was something unheard of in normal Indian society at the time. Another lodge in Madras was established in 1883 for the special benefit and convenience of native gentlemen. However, things were more complicated religiously for the Hindu Masons, whose spiritual allegiance was normally tied to a family priest and a specific deity. Brother Pillai, who was a former district grand secretary of Madras, has recorded that, quote, candidates professing the Hindu religion were obligated by their Hindu priest, who was then taken into the lodge and returned blindfolded, unquote. That is, the candidate for initiation in the lodge was accompanied by his family priest, a non-Mason, who was blindfolded so as not to observe the lodge from inside. The obligation or oath of the candidate involved the swearing upon a volume of sacred law, but in order to consummate this event, the candidate's personal priest was invited into the lodge as a witness so that the candidate would give his sincere submission to God. However, this practice soon came under strong suspicion, as the personal devotion to a specific deity in the Hindu pantheon could not be officially recognized as, quote, monotheism. Now we have Hindu responses themselves to this process. In response to denigrating criticism, 19th century Hindus deployed various strategies in defense of their own traditions, ultimately affirming the essentially monotheistic character of Hindu religion. One of the early reform movements to do this, in fact, was called the Brahmo Samaj, established in Calcutta by Sri Ram Mohan Roy in 1828. The Brahmo Samaj initiated a strong articulation of what I referred to as Vedanta, or Vedantic monotheism among educated Hindus, such that the idea of Brahman was asserted to be akin to Western monotheism. The synthetic ideas of this movement reflect the early stages of what is called Neo-Vedanta, and that usually refers to a 19th century kind of revival of the ancient Vedanta philosophy. This philosophy is such that whereby Hindus were reacting to Western criticism of indigenous practices. There was also possible influences of Freemasonry at this early time. I have a quote from Britannica. Ram Mohan Roy was chiefly inspired by 18th century deism, rational belief in a transcendent creator God, and Unitarianism, belief in God's essential oneness. But some of his writings suggest that he was aware of the religious ideas of the Freemasons, in bracket, a secret fraternity that espouses some deistic concepts. Several of his European friends were members of the active Masonic Lodge in Calcutta. Unquote from Britannica. The similarity between the Brahmo Samaj and Freemasonry, in fact, can be deduced by examining the foundational beliefs of the Brahmo Samaj, published in their official statement. Quote, "There is only one God, who is the Creator, Preserver, and Savior of the world. He is Spirit. He is infinite in power, wisdom, love, justice, and holiness. He is omnipresent, eternal, and blissful. The human soul is immortal and capable of infinite progress, and is responsible to God for its doings." Unquote. The resemblance to Freemasonry here helps us to understand, in fact, how many Hindus were members of both organizations, including the later famous Hindu monk named Swami Vivekananda. As in Freemasonry, these reform movements, like the Brahmo Samaj, rejected idol worship or icon veneration, as well as caste distinctions. However, the rejection of idol worship or icon worship and the repudiation of caste hierarchies in these movements were not articulated as new phases in Hindu thought. In fact, the arguments that were presented was that they were aberrations in the Hindu tradition. The reformers argued that idols and caste were absent in the ancient Vedic cult of sacrificial worship in ancient India, and only developed as aberrations under the later Puranic, or what are called tantric influences. Though the four castes, or the four varnas as they are called, are mentioned once in the Vedas, they are not presented as binding or hereditary. A case was even made against the strict vegetarian diet of many Hindus, since the Vedic sages and forebears were believed to have sacrificed and consumed meat. The Hindu reformers of the 19th century were thus true reformers in the sense of directing the Hindu tradition back to its Vedic roots by eliminating many of the so-called accretions that were viewed as mere degenerations, such as polytheism, idol worship, and rigid caste structures. A supporting example may be found in the case of Zoroastrianism, an ancient Persian branch or offshoot of Vedic religion that survives today in India as known as the Parsis. After many centuries, they remain, in fact, purely monotheistic, iconoclastic, non-vegetarian, and without any strict class or social hierarchy. Other forms of response to Masonic exclusionism of the Europeans sought resemblance in concepts from Hindu mythology. For example, there in fact is an ancient deity mentioned in the Vedas and the Puranas that Hindus refer to as the divine architect, an early figure known as Vishwakarma. He's sometimes identified as Prajapati, but he is present in the Rig Veda in numerous verses. Book 10, 81, verse 2 or 3, and chapter 82, verse 2. As, quote, the divine architect of the universe, the personification of creative power which wields heaven and earth together. Vishwakarma's importance is further extended in later Puranic Hinduism, wherein he is described as a kind of master craftsman and builder. Quote, he, Vishwakarman, brought to perfection the science of sthapatya, as it's called, or architecture, and was the master of all the arts, of handicrafts, of carpentry, the maker of celestial chariots, and fashioner of divine ornaments, unquote. This idea, coupled with the acceptance of the soul's immortality, would seem to favor Hindus being admitted to the craft. The conclusive move, however, was made when all of the various gods and goddesses were proclaimed to be but symbols or aspects of the one true Brahman, who was either personal or impersonal. Now we come to the question about the bylaws and how they were superseded by some of the more strategic methods of the educated Hindu class. Although a few Hindus were already beginning to enter the craft in Madras, as we mentioned in other more remote locations, this practice came under serious scrutiny and prohibition with the reinforcement in the early 1860s of select regulations known as bylaws. Giving the provincial Grand Master of Bengal a large degree of autonomy in matters of membership selection, the bylaws were regulations that were democratically enacted by the provincial Grand Lodges, but which in turn might not reflect the general attitude of the craft. The principal issues raised by these regulations, barring native Hindus from membership, seemed to revolve around their religious beliefs and their social standing via the caste system. Their beliefs also in turn made it difficult to convince conservative members that a binding oath could be enacted upon them. As a result, bylaws were established in the colonial lodges that could be used to provide obstacles to native membership. According to Gupta, quote, the obstinate Christian ethics and class consciousness of the English, especially in the presidency towns, led Bengal to enact and use the provincial bylaw number 55, which became notorious later on in 1860s when it was used to prohibit the initiation of any Asiatic man without the previous approval of the provincial Grand Master, unquote. The bylaws were not consistent, however, since it was not only polytheism that prevented membership. Even other monotheistic traditions like Islam were held with reservation. Bylaw number 55 stated, in fact, quote, no Mohammedan or other Asiatic shall be initiated in any lodge without previous sanction of the provincial Grand Master, unquote. Since this statement was not in logical congruence, in fact, with the tenets of Freemasonry, as established by the English founders, the regulation was vulnerable to being challenged by educated native Indians seeking admission. This proved, in fact, to be the case with one very determined Bengali gentleman by the name of Prasanna Kumar Dutt, or we'll call him simply P.C. Dutt, D-U-T-T, spell. He, in fact, brought these issues to the open attention of the craft in England in a long, drawn-out, 9-year negotiation. Now we talk a little bit about Brother Prasanna Kumar Dutt. The Masonic tenets of universal brotherhood and equality were put to their first official test when Prasanna Kumar Dutt, or P.C. Dutt, a Bengali in Calcutta, petitioned for the degrees from Grand Lodge, from the Lodge Courage with Humanity, as it called, number 392 in 1863. When the matter was placed before the new provincial Grand Master, Brother Hugh David Sandeman, he promptly ruled that, quote, Hindus were not eligible for admission into Masonry, and further that it was not desirable with reference to social considerations that they should be admitted. And as long as he held a veto under the bylaws, he would exercise the power rigidly, unquote. In response, P.C. Dutt set out to demonstrate that the basic teachings of Freemasonry must in no way exclude men of other races and religions, and that his own personal beliefs coincided with those of the lodge. In a formal statement, he pleaded, quote, "I'm not a pantheist or a polytheist. I do not identify my Creator with any one of his creatures. I believe in the existence of one great architect of the universe, whose wish is the happiness of all creatures, whose will is law. I humbly trust that your lordship may revoke a decree that debars so many of the human race from an order which professes to be open to all and to exclude no man on account of his religion. In common with a large number of my countrymen, I am, for social reasons, obliged to conform to certain caste rules. But I am not now, nor ever was, an idolater. And while Muslims, Jews, and Parsis are admitted, I complain that our Hindus, or our exclusion as Hindus, is most unjust." Unquote. To make matters worse, the provincial Grand Master determined then that, due to the native Hindu beliefs in polytheism, there was no form of oath that could be binding on a Hindu. Yet P.C. Dutt fought this point with a rebuttal, inquiring, quote, "whether a Hindu can be initiated into the craft on the same oath as that by which he assumes charge of the duty of a judge of the High Court or a member of the Viceroy's Council, etc." Unquote. At that time, in fact, many educated Bengalis who were already practicing law requiring an oath of allegiance to a higher power began themselves to question the double standards that they perceived around them. Eventually, the English Grand Master, in accordance with the liberal approaches of Masonic tolerance, struck down these bylaws, we could say fortunately, and ultimately made it possible for the free admission of Hindus. As a result of P.C. Dutt's diligence on matters of belief, his petition, in fact, was finally approved, and in 1872 he was raised a Master Mason in Anchor and Hope Lodge No. 234, English Constitution. Brother P.C. Dutt was a man of strong determination who nonetheless endured 9 years of endless petitions, correspondence, religious explanations, rejection, argument, and appeals with Masonic officers in England and India. By 1874, however, Dutt was elected as Master of Anchor and Hope Lodge, and he became the first Indian to become Master of a lodge in colonial India. He was also elected Deputy District Grand Master in 1895. By the admission of non-Europeans as full members, Freemasonry ultimately succeeded in helping to bring a new wave of equality and fellowship to the otherwise divided colonies. According to Professor Harlan Jacobs, P.C. Dutt and other South Asians who joined Freemasonry had forced British Masons to fulfill their institution's claim to cosmopolitan brotherhood. Unquote. In fact, she affirmed that Dutt's initiation marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of Freemasonry in India, a period in which, in fact, it was not unusual to see multiracial lodges and widespread admission of indigenous candidates, regardless of their religion. Of the approximately 100 lodges at work in India during the early 1870s, at least 1/5 included indigenous members. The ecumenical nature of Masonic gatherings may have been the impetus for a further surge in membership. As stated by a contemporary Masonic historian, resolution of these issues came in the second half of the 19th century, and many Indians, regardless of caste or religion, flocked to join the craft. They were fully integrated within the lodges. The books, which they regarded as holy, being placed alongside the Bible on the Master's pedestal. This practice continues in India today, whereby 5 volumes of sacred law are placed on Masonic altars. Normally they are the Bhagavad Gita for the Hindus, the Bible for the Jew and the Christian, the Quran for the Muslim, the Zend-Avesta for the Parsi or Zoroastrian, and the Granth for the Sikh, followers of Sikhism. A reference here is appropriate to Rudyard Kipling, the great colonial writer, who joined the Lodge of Hope and Perseverance, number 782 in Lahore, present-day Pakistan. He wrote on the diversity he found in this lodge, quote, "In 1885 I was made a Freemason by dispensation being underage, because the lodge hoped for a good secretary. Here I met Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, members of the Arya and Brahmo Samaj, and a Jew Tyler. So another world opened to me, which I needed." Unquote. Later, upon his moving to Allahabad in central India, Kipling chose to participate in a lodge that had non-Europeans among its members. Even members of the English nobility were astonished at how well Freemasonry had been adopted by the native Indians at this time. Lord Ampthill, when he was District Grand Master for Madras, said in 1901, quote, "It seems to me that here in Freemasonry we have found the common ground on which we can meet in a friendly fashion, exchange ideas without restraint or formality, and get to know and understand one another better. If I am right, and if Freemasonry in India is tending to this end, it will be the best influence that the craft has had on the destinies of mankind." Unquote. Now we come to the second gentleman mentioned who joined the craft following P.C. Dutt, Brother P.C. Dutt, and who became worldwide figure. He's a famous figure. He became the most famous Hindu Swami or Hindu monk probably ever in terms of international acclaim. But he began his career as a member of the Brahmo Samaj and also as a Freemason. His original name is Narendranath Dutt, and he shared the same last name as P.C. Dutt, but is later known as Swami Vivekananda. We'll begin by saying that Brother P.C. Dutt introduced the 21-year-old Narendranath Dutt, who lived from 1863 to 1902, and who became famous later on as Swami Vivekananda. P.C. Dutt introduced him to the craft in his own lodge, Anchor and Hope, in 1884. Prior to P.C. Dutt and the issues of the Bylaws, a handful of Hindus had joined various lodges in silent and simple fellowship. In these cases, however, there was very little attempt to actually reconcile Hindu philosophy with Masonic teachings in a credible or sophisticated manner. In the earliest days, they just were kind of, inducted into the lodge without much concern in terms of the repercussions. Now, as Brother P.C. Dutt had crossed over that threshold by officially being recognized as both a Mason and then as a master of the lodge, this opened the door for the kind of official entry of Hindu members of Masonic lodges. Now was a time to strike a more serious and abiding liaison between Masonry and Hindu philosophy. This was done through Swami Vivekananda. As a brilliant student at the Scottish Rite College in Calcutta, we'll call him Naren Dutt to distinguish him from P.C. Dutt. Naren Dutt studied avidly the great European philosophers such as Kant, Hume, and Hegel. In time he grew dissatisfied with the rituals and dogmas of his own Hindu tradition and began attending meetings of the Brahmo Samaj. His father, Vishwanath Dutt, was a successful high court attorney, and he wanted his son to follow in his own footsteps. Vishwanath's close friends, including both W.C. Banerjee, the first president of the Indian National Congress and the most distinguished advocate of his time, and Nimai Chandra Basu, the attorney at law whose firm actually employed Naren Dutt as an articled clerk, were active members of a Masonic lodge, Lodge Anchor and Hope, the same lodge of P.C. Dutt. While Vishwanath's membership, in fact, is not recorded, so that's not certain, he did encourage his own son, that is Naren Dutt, to join the fraternity. As a quote from the biography, "For the sake of his future career, Vishwanath made Narendranath become a Freemason, for by this time he had reached the minimum age limit of 21 years. On February 19, 1884, he was initiated in Lodge Anchor and Hope, number 234, now the Grand Lodge of India, number 1. In those days it was the fashion for educated Indians, mainly lawyers, judges, and government officials, to become Freemasons. Dutt, that is Naren Dutt, was subsequently passed as a fellow craft on the 15th of April and raised as a Master Mason on May 30th, 1884, 12 years, in fact, after P.C. Dutt was admitted to the craft in the same lodge. Though he did not become master of the lodge, as did P.C. Dutt, Narendranath Dutt, as a master mason, was guaranteed access to all the secrets of the craft as well as entrance into any duly constituted lodge in the world. Narendra Dutt's Freemasonry was not forgotten, however, in his overseas missionary work, even after he became Swami Vivekananda. Narendra Dutt was no doubt impressed with the principles of universal tolerance and equality as taught in the 3 degrees of Freemasonry, since these were also core values of Vedanta. He had already been in contact with the famous saint Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa for nearly 3 years, and was even contemplating a life of spirituality and renunciation. This, along with his own vow of celibacy in 1882, seems to refute the notion that he joined Freemasonry purely for professional reasons. It is most likely that he was on the quest for wisdom and realization of the potential for a practical bond of friendship and brotherhood across ethnic and linguistic lines, values that would meld together with this practical and universal approach to the Indian philosophy of Vedanta. Though uncomfortable with dogmatic Christianity as practiced by many Englishmen, Narendra Dutt responded well to his experiences in the Masonic Lodge, where he now saw morality, toleration, equality, virtue, self-improvement, brotherly love, relief, and truth as fully inculcated in his teachings. As interpreted by Brother Pratap Chandra Chunder, one of the first to actually write on the Masonic membership of Swami Vivekananda, and someone that I've met personally, interviewed, he stated that in the Masonic temple in Calcutta, Narendranath Dutt must have seen how such barriers of race, color, or creed were demolished among the brethren who were associated with Freemasonry. Here the rulers and the ruled, white, black, brown, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Shudra, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, were all together as Masonic brethren. They all met at one level in the Masonic temple. And for one born and bred in a dependent country and belonging to a subject nation, this experience must have been exhilarating. And he must have thought well enough of the craft to have established Masonic contact, in fact, in Chicago 6 years after taking monastic vows, and to prefer being addressed as brother while in the U.S. And he goes on to say that such personal experience must have emboldened the youthful Indian monk to face the conquering races in the West with confidence and equanimity. With the sudden death of his father in 1884, along with other financial problems, Narendra Dutt was compelled to discontinue his Masonic activities and thus prepare for a radical change in his life's mission. He studied Vedanta philosophy from Sri Ramakrishna since their first meeting in 1881, and then decided to heed the call of Hinduism and undertake the life of a religious ascetic. He took monastic vows in 1887 at the age of 24 and adopted the name of Swami Vivekananda in South India with the blessings of the Maharaj of Khetri. It was his spiritual perseverance to spread the teachings of Vedanta philosophy, mixed to some degree with his Masonic training and the practical principles of universal fellowship and charity, that most likely drove Swami Vivekananda to become the most famous and influential Hindu spiritual leader in the world. By the end of the 19th century, it seemed Freemasonry and Vedanta philosophy, that is, the unifying philosophy of the Hindu tradition, was destined to come to terms with each other, both endeavoring to seek a practical realization and application of the teachings of universal brotherhood, charity, and tolerance under the rule of a supreme being. Through a close study of the Upanishads, Reformed Hindu scholars and thinkers were able, in fact, to easily circumvent the polytheistic stigma of the Hindu religion by restating the Vedanta principle that all the gods could be viewed as features or aspects of the one true God, or Brahman. This cardinal tenet of Vedanta philosophy was not only deemed compatible with Masonic teachings, but was fused with the Masonic principles of humanitarianism and charity to form what is called, I sometimes refer to it as Masonic Vedanta. Swami Vivekananda, as a Freemason and Vedantist, expanded and developed these notions and spread his teachings of universal brotherhood and charity through his worldwide missionary activity. His most famous presence, you might say, in the world occurred when he went to America. So after becoming Swami Vivekananda, he journeyed across the Pacific Ocean and responded to an invitation to speak at the World Parliament of Religions, which was to be held in Chicago in 1893 in conjunction with the World's Fair. Armed with optimism and his new synthetic approach to Vedanta, Swami Vivekananda found an eager audience in the West when he traveled to Chicago in 1893. In this event, he made history by becoming the first Hindu seminal figure to introduce Vedanta philosophy to the Western world. In his opening statement on September 11th, he spoke, "Sisters and brothers of America, I thank you in the name of the most ancient order of monks in the world. I thank you in the name of the mother of religions. I thank you in the name of millions and millions of Hindu people of all classes and sects." It was reported that when Swami Vivekananda addressed the audience as "Sisters and brothers of America," the people went into rapture, and with a peal of applause that lasted several minutes. He emphasized then in speech the record of Hindu tolerance over centuries, and said that he was very proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. In a tone reminiscent of Masonic prescriptions of tyranny and fanaticism, Swami Vivekananda struck a chord with his strong anti-fanaticism remarks. Quote, "Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this beautiful earth. They have filled the earth with violence, drenched it often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair." Throughout several talks, Vivekananda focused on the gradual perfection of the human being rather than a radical change or abandonment of previous stages of life. In this respect, he resembled Masonic teachings of the gradual receipt of Masonic light through stages or degrees. A feature of Masonic membership was the certifiable acceptance of a Master Mason into the Fellowship of Lodges worldwide, as confirmed by a well-known Masonic spokesman of the 19th century. It is certain that Swami Vivekananda, relying on his Masonic association, established contact with Masons when he was in Chicago for the Parliament of Religions. According to record, he was scheduled to address the Brethren of a lodge in Chicago in January 1894, but his prior engagements prevented him. In a valuable letter that has surfaced and is preserved by the Ramakrishna Mission, the mission that was founded by Swami Vivekananda, it is revealed that on January 22, 1894, a brother G.C. Connor wrote to Brother Gilbert W. Bernard at the Masonic Temple in Chicago, and I'll read from that letter. "My dear brother, I take very great pleasure in introducing to you personally and as a Freemason our East India brother Swami Vivekananda, whom I have examined in the English work in which he was made a Master Mason in Anchor and Hope Lodge, 236. It should have read 234. English Constitution. I will add that I am here to attend the convention of all the lodges of the city tonight, and the brethren are very much disappointed that his lecture engagements prevent Brother Vivekananda from being among us. Sincerely yours, G.C. Connor." This document, in fact, confirms the factual continuity between the Freemason Narendut and the Hindu monk Swami Vivekananda. In a new book that has come to light, Ashim Chaudhary has written in Swami Vivekananda in Chicago, New Findings. This book was published in 2000. It offers proof that Swami Vivekananda visited a Masonic temple in Chicago, and he gave some lectures there, etc., and he made some friendships and made connections, but it doesn't go into much detail beyond that. He did discuss various religious beliefs and superstitions and gave some illustrations of their causes and effects, declaring that all religions are one, and that the state of the soul should be to free itself from bondage and to achieve immortality. Quote, "We are all aiming for the same thing, all traveling in the same direction, all going to the same place." As he found success in America, Swami Vivekananda frequently spoke about the possibility, in fact, of a universal religion of tolerance and brotherhood. He felt disdain for the view that only one religion was true. He strongly argued that all religions contain a divine aspect, a particle of God, so to speak. In this way, his lecturing was silently guided by Masonic principles of tolerance and benevolence, which he was able to link with ancient Indian or Hindu values already found in Vedanta and Yoga philosophies. His eclectic vision was in consonance with Masonry, which professed a universal religion, quote, to which all men might agree, unquote. As one goes through the what are called the collected works of Swami Vivekananda, one finds, in fact, unfortunately, no direct reference to a particular lodge or a Masonic symbol or teaching as such. However, through close reading, one can feel, in fact, intuit the sense that he knew these basic principles of humanitarian brotherhood and love and relief, and that these principles guided him in his vision of a worldwide universal religion. So in several of his lectures, in fact, he talks about universal brotherhood and a religion that in fact he sees as already present in the world, that is working out its plan in silence among enlightened individuals. This certainly resonates with the reality of Freemasonry as a silent social force in the world that proceeds unencumbered by personal desire or gain. And this is quoting from him again from his collected works. That universal religion about which philosophers and others have dreamed in every country already exists. It is here. As the universal brotherhood of man is already existing, so also is universal religion. Brotherhood already exists. There are already numbers of persons who fail to see this and only upset it by crying for new brotherhoods. Universal religion is already here. Throughout his work, he cites not only the Vedas and the Upanishads, but the Bhagavad Gita, philosophies of yoga, which he weaves in and out with his current notions, his vision of humanitarian aid and relief. What is interesting about much of his teaching is that he places America in the center of the realization of this universal religion. He has categorical praise for America for its unique role in establishing a foundation for his universal religion of peace and tolerance. This can be properly understood only in reference to his knowledge of the Masonic influences on the formation of the United States. Swami Vivekananda, as I mentioned earlier, established the Ramakrishna Mission on May 1st, 1897 in the United States. The mission statement emphasized service to others and advocated man's focus on adherence to duty while remaining detached from reward. Carl Jackson, another scholar of new religions, has stated that it seems clear that the Ramakrishna movement would almost surely not have embraced a program of humanitarianism and social welfare without Vivekananda's insistent urging. And then back to Brother Pratap Chandra Chunder, who did incredible research on Swami Vivekananda. He says that Vivekananda's humanitarianism sprung directly from his Masonic association, such that, quote, there was very little basic difference between the ideals of charity preached by Freemasonry and Swami Vivekananda. Both set up organizations to give concrete shape to their concepts relating to charity in a broad humanitarian sense. Swami Vivekananda was an embodiment of Freemasonry and gave it a concrete shape through his profession and practice. Certainly it is observed that Vivekananda's successors have clearly accepted his service ideal, making humanitarianism one of the Ramakrishna movement's identifying characteristics. Thus, even though Vivekananda had outwardly disconnected himself from both Freemasonry and the Brahmo Samaj, the relative ease and confidence with which he proclaimed universal brotherhood and humanitarianism in the West reflected his uncredited indebtedness to Masonic ideals. So this will wrap up our session on Freemasonry in India. I wanted to say a couple of more things about the current situation in India today. The complex blending of Hinduism, Vedanta philosophy, and Freemasonry survives today in the many lodges that are affiliated with the Grand Lodge of India, which was in fact established on November 24th in 1961 as a separate body from the European lodges. Until 1961, Masonic lodges in India were chartered and governed by the Grand Lodges of England, Scotland, and Ireland separately. The Grand Lodge of India contains today about 356 or more lodges. That's not the current number, but many of which are under the new Indian Grand Lodge system. These lodges bear Sanskritic or Hindu-related names, indicating sustained compatibility between Hinduism and Masonic ideals. For example, there was a lodge Vishwanath in Bombay. There's a Ganges Lodge, Aryavarta Lodge, Hindustan Lodge, Suryodaya Lodge in Kanpur. There's a Vidya and Shanti Lodge in Madras. There's a Sri Brihadishvara Lodge in Tanjore. Brihadishvara is the name of the god Shiva, that is the governing deity of the city of Tanjore, so that is interesting. The presence of Vishwakarma Lodge, we mentioned Vishwakarma as the great architect mentioned the Vedas. There's actually a lodge named Vishwakarma Lodge in Ludhiana, in Punjab. Other interesting lodge names include Mother India, the Buddha Lodge, Aryan Lodge, Light of Zoroaster, Golden Pagoda, and Maharaj Lodge. There's a lodge Vivekananda, in fact, at Kanyakumari in the tip of South India, the place where Swami Vivekananda meditated on a rock island. All the lodges display the 5 volumes of the Sacred Law and conduct business in English. In this presentation, then, in conclusion, I have attempted to present a brief portrait of Freemasonry in India, along with developments leading to the phenomenon of the confluence of the religious ideas associated with Hindu religion, particularly Vedanta philosophy, and the Masonic ideals. Freemasonry had begun in England with very high ideals of universal brotherhood and equality, the same ideals which helped to foment the major revolutions in Europe and America. Yet the quick exportation of Masonic lodges to non-Western countries resulted in these ideals being subjected to rigorous trial. It was particularly in India, as we've seen, with the overriding presence of a large non-European cultural and religious clientele, that the Masonic principles faced their most significant challenge. While it seemed an uphill battle to win the hearts of colonial Masons over to the possibility of Hindu Masons, it was due to their diligent efforts of aspiring Indian Masons that India proved to be a place where the Masonic principles of universal brotherhood and equality would blossom into something like what we are calling Masonic Vedanta. A fascinating yet complex phenomenon in the complex of the confluence of religious ideas. The European Masons, having grown accustomed to placing only the Bible on the altar of their lodges, were obligated in foreign lands to include other volumes of sacred law next to the Bible in recognition of other brands of monotheism. As we have seen, the Indian situation was resolved by negotiation and argument, as well as through theological adjustment between polytheism and monotheism. Aspiring Hindu Masons took the British Masons to task, while at the same time underscoring the features of Hinduism that were most closely aligned to Freemasonry. That is, the presence of Vishwakarma and the belief in immortality of the soul, and especially Vedanta philosophy with its conceptions of a unified theistic Brahman, as well as rejecting those aspects deemed unfavorable, such as polytheism, icon worship, and caste distinctions. These discarded aspects were also believed by the reformers to have been either absent or negligible in the ancient Indo-Aryan traditions, thus strengthening their own case. The pinnacle of this achievement in the East was found in the life and work of Swami Vivekananda and also his predecessor, Brother P.C. Dutt. There are some interesting parallels that can be also observed in the rise of the famous American Mason, Brother Albert Pike, who studied and knew Sanskrit. He translated texts. He wrote about Hinduism. He blended Vedanta philosophy into his famous book, Morals and Dogma. And in fact, he was more or less of a contemporary of Swami Vivekananda, although they never met. But it would be very interesting to speculate their meeting as something of a very significant event. Thus, we'll end this session, and I thank you very much. for your listening. Fraternally, this is Dr. Guy Beck signing off. So mote it be.